Hi everybody, and welcome to this simple guide to make your own sourdough bread. For this recipe, we'll need about 1.5 cups of warm water, half a cup of sourdough starter, 3 cups of flour, and 1 big teaspoon of salt. And here are the steps we'll roughly follow, but I'll go more in details throughout the video. You can also find this recipe on my website, miammiam.app. The first thing I'm doing is taking my starter out of the fridge. I'm gonna use it cold. As you can see here, my starter is nice and all bubbly, and I'm gonna mix it with lukewarm water just to bring it back to about room temperature. You don't have to be super precise. At the end, your dough is gonna get to the same temperature as the room. So I'm pouring in a little bit of starter. I think it's about half a cup, maybe. No need to be precise here. The less starter you use, the longer the fermentation. So I'm basically diluting the starter in the water. Unlike when adding the starter to the dough, adding it to the water is just much easier to mix. Now I'll be adding the cups of flour. So for this video I'm using 1 cup of all-purpose flour, 1 cup of bread flour, and 1 cup of whole wheat flour. It doesn't really matter, you could do a bread with just all-purpose flour and it will work just fine. And I like to mix my different flours just to get, the nice taste of the whole wheat flour and a good texture thanks to the bread flour. But overall, it's up to you and how do you like your breads. I like whole wheat flour overall. It has a lot of flavor and it's very nutritious. It has minerals and fibers. It's all good for you. And plus, it makes the bread a little bit denser. I don't really like those big airy bubbles that you see with white breads because typically when I spread my jam, it gets through the bread and makes a real mess. And I also make sure to put back a little bit of flour in my sourdough starter to refresh it. And I'm also adding a little bit of warm water. And I'm preparing my starter now. So I'm gonna let my starter rise for about 4 hours before putting it back to the fridge, ready to be used again in my next bread. And I just added a little bit more water as I found the starter to be a little too stiff. And I just mix thoroughly until I have a nice consistency and no dry flour left in my mix. I made a sourdough starter guide if you're interested in making your own sourdough. You'll find the link in the card and in the description below. Okay. And finally I will put in the salt. The salt enhances the bread flavor, so it's really up to you how much you put in. And I typically add a big teaspoon of salt, but again it's up to you, try less or more, it's gonna work out just fine. And now I mix everything up. You could use a spoon, a spatula, everything you have ready. You could also use your hands, although I personally find that to be pretty sticky at this stage, so I avoid it myself. And I'm not actually going to knead the dough. I'm simply mixing it so that there's no dry flour left. That's what I'm trying to do here. Basically because the sourdough bread requires a long fermentation, and all this time will help the dough naturally develop its gluten structure to build its elasticity. I finally use my scraper around the bowl just to clean it up. It's totally optional, it's up to you. But I prefer it when it's, looking neat. And that's it. The most time consuming part of this process is over. So all I will do now is just cover up with a cloth to prevent the dough from drying too much. Okay, and an hour later, we're ready to start our stretch and folds. This particular dough is quite wet, So it's still a bit sticky and a lot stretchy, so at this point I'm just stretching it any way I can just to tighten up the dough. You could use less water in your recipe and it would make it much easier to manipulate, but again, if your hands are really wet, it shouldn't be a big issue. And that's about it. At this point the dough is not as sticky as it used to be in the beginning, and it started to be stretchy, so it's a good sign. So I'm gonna scrape again the bowl and put back the cloth over. About 30 minutes later, it's time for a second set of stretch and folds. And I'm using a wet scraper just to help me detach the dough from the sides of the bowl. So I'm putting it from underneath. What I'm doing right now is a technique called coil folds, and I do about 4 of them. So you pull the dough from the bowl on the side, fold it on itself, and put it back. And turn the bowl and repeat that 4 times. Ideally I try to do about 2 to 3 stretch and folds over the course of the next 2 hours. It's okay if you miss some stretch and folds, even if you don't do any at all. It gives bread a little bit extra structure and help it rise some more, but you could do without it and get great results anyways. And again, 30 minutes later, I'm gonna do my last stretch and folds. I will use the same technique here, the coil folds. It's one I like, but there's others that you can find if you're interested. What I really like about bread making is that there's no need to be super precise. It's just simply flour and water and a little bit of salt, and you end up with having bread. If you add more water, yeah, it's gonna be a moister bread, but it's still gonna be bread. So don't beat yourself too hard if you don't do all the techniques that I show, or if you adapt your recipe to your needs. And you'll notice for this last set of stretch and folds that the dough is very stretchy. I'm testing the window pane just for you here as a bonus. You can stretch it so thin that you can see light through the dough. And that's a clear sign that the gluten network has properly developed. Now that we have a good structure in the dough, it's time for the bulk fermentation. So I'm gonna leave the dough to rest for about 1 hour. So it's now about 4 hours after I just started the bread. And as you can see, my sourdough starter is ready. It almost doubled in volume. So I tightened up the cap and put it back in the fridge, ready to be used next time. Now it's time to shape the dough. As you can see, my dough grew a little. So for shaping, what I'm doing is I'm sprinkling water on the counter. It really doesn't matter what kind of counter you have. Mine is suboptimal to make breads, but you know what? It just works. So I scraped a little bit the dough from the bowl so that it can fall easily on the counter. And I'm gonna use my wet hands to manipulate the dough. I find that using water instead of flour on the counter is a lot less messy than with flour, and it's just as easy to manipulate. So I ended up preferring this way, but I let you try. So I'm using rice flour on the cloth. Rice flour is going to prevent the dough from sticking to the cloth. If you use regular flour, it might end up just merging with the dough and ultimately merging with the cloth, and you really don't want to do that. So if you don't have rice flour, use a lot of all-purpose flour on your cloth, or you could use alternatively semolina or polenta. So what I'm doing here is I'm stretching the dough and folding it on itself. I'm having a little triangle shape here with the base larger than the top, and I'm rolling the dough, trying to create tensions with my thumbs as I roll. So it's gonna give a lot of strength to the dough now and help it keep its shape. And finally, I'm just shaping some more to form a round ball. Yeah, it's really therapeutic, isn't it? So I'm sprinkling a little bit of rice flour. It's simply for me to be able to catch the dough without it sticking to my hands and placing it in a bowl. Since it's a very wet dough and I really don't want it to stick to the cloth, I will add some more rice flour to the sides of the dough. And I'll stretch a little bit the dough just to make sure that the flour gets everywhere that the dough is in contact with the cloth. And as you can see, my hands are relatively clean and the counter is not so messy. There's just a little bit of rice flour, but that's going to be very easy for me to clean up. And again, that's one of the things I really like about this technique. So I let the dough rise for about 2 hours on my counter. Alternatively, you could put it in the fridge for up to 2 days. And I'm now preheating the oven at 500 degrees and putting my Dutch oven in the oven. So I let it preheat for about 30 minutes so that the Dutch oven is really hot. And when ready, either you take out the dough from the fridge if you've put it in the fridge, or in my case it was on the counter. So I will just need to transfer it on a parchment paper sheet. You might notice it's not my original dough. I had to retake, I had a technical issue. So I made another one with another bread, but it was the same recipe. And I love the scoring step. It's really where you can get creative with your bread. You can do all sorts of shapes. You can score your bread from diamonds, to curves, to spirals, even to the worst nightmares of your kids. But for this video I'll keep it simple and score lengthwise about at a third of the bread, with the blade 45 degrees inclined. So I try to go, well, less than an inch deep. And I also trace the flour to celebrate spring that's coming over Canada, hopefully soon. And I'm now ready to bake the bread. So be careful when taking out the Dutch oven from the oven. It's extremely hot and not all gloves are actually made to handle 500 degrees. So be careful with your gloves, and you might end up purchasing specialty gloves just for that. So watch out, it's extremely hot. And the parchment paper actually helps me to safely put the dough in the Dutch oven. So I put the lid on, and the oven's still at 500 degrees. I will bake for 25 minutes. And now it's the moment of truth. 25 minutes later, you'll see finally the fruit of your work. When you open up this lid, look at that, it is amazing. Beautiful bread, nice oven spring. So I'm gonna put the bread back in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes at 450 degrees. 10 minutes for golden crust, it's gonna be quite thin, and 15 minutes for dark brown crust, really delicious. Look at that. Isn't it beautiful? I wish you could smell what I smell now. So I advise you to let your bread cool on a rack for about 2 hours, because actually the bread is still super hot inside and it's still cooking, and you want it to finish cooking before using it. And that's it. On the next day, I'm ready to consume my bread for breakfast. I hope you enjoyed this video and realize that making bread isn't so hard. You can make delicious sourdough bread at home. It's really easy to do, it doesn't cost much, and you won't regret it, I promise. Most likely you won't be able to find such delicious breads in your local stores. Look at that. It's moist, it's airy, just great. And you can customize this recipe. You can add any sorts of seeds I didn't show you in that video, but it's something that I really like to do. Have a great day and see you next time.